Alrighty everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing an in-depth guide on Stella, and this is going to just be full everything, her kit, modes, everything I've tested her on, some just fun stuff I found while testing her, and so on and so forth. So we'll go ahead and get started. There are quite a few things on here. So first off, she is a Bloodborne and a medium. So Bloodborne is oversaturated. There's quite a few Bloodborne, so she does still have a place, but overall I'll just preface this by saying Stella, I feel in the current modes and what we have for her, is very niche. Her biggest use is killing enemies that have shields, and if they don't have shields, then she does very little damage. So that kind of limits her in the content that she can do and what capabilities she has, and so we'll just go over some things. She's an assassin, crescent moon, so it is interesting to have a crescent moon that is a not so much of a support, because it's very support oriented for those choices, and so it'd be difficult to kind of swap her out or to kind of double up on that. It increases her usability. The other interesting thing is this right here. So this is piercing damage. Before, true damage was pretty much the exact same thing on here. So now that leads to questions on what is exactly true damage going to be. Is true damage going to be ignores all physical and magic defense and still the 200% damage does shield? So we'll have to see once we get a character that does true damage. On here, the other additional interesting thing is this damage type is not affected by physical damage and magic damage related effects. So this has both a positive and a negative. The positive being that if you are affected with a debuff that decreases your physical and magic damage, it's not going to affect her damage type. The downside is that if you have a buff that increases that, then she's not going to gain from those buffs. What that means is that she would want most likely all damage as one of her specs instead of a physical and magical damage for her echoed gear, her soul strike gear. So that was an interesting thing there, and then it did correlate well with the tests on it. Moving on, we have her values, so her HP attack, physical defense, and magic defense. So I just went through my guidebook and just double checked everything. So she's currently 19th place for BP, and she's 6th out of 8th as far as just assassins. She's the 12th lowest HP out of all of the SR and SR characters. Then again, 6th out of 8th for assassins. She's the 12th highest attack, so that puts her basically in the upper 30th percentile. She's the 2nd of 8th for assassins, so she's the 2nd highest attack out of the assassins. She is 23rd for physical defense overall, so that places her about the middle. Then she's 7th out of 8th for assassins, so she has the 2nd lowest physical defense out of all of the assassins, and then she has the 2nd lowest magical defense out of every single SR and SSR character, again 7th out of 8th for the assassins. Overall, her base stats aren't too impressive. A decent-ish attack, anything over 10k is kind of in the range of ancestors and healers who naturally have a higher attack. And that was some pretty interesting mechanics going on just off of just this right here. So then I went through and I looked, okay, what are her values? A lot of her things are based off of multiple hits. So multiple hits, piercing damage to all enemies within range. So it's kind of nice that she could hit multiple enemies as an assassin, which most of them tend to be lacking. I think Eskelrain can kind of hit multiple enemies. Gilrain could kind of hit multiple enemies with his ultimate, but then the rest of their kit basically cannot. It's only single target on them. The biggest upside to her is the very interesting talent. So it took quite a bit of reading over and going over it, so I'll just kind of break it down as I go over this with you guys. So when Stella deals damage to a target, except for her talent, so her talent can't self-prolificate more procs. That would basically be an unlimited proc if that was the case. So whose stasis has not reached 50% of its max HP. In testing this does appear to be somewhat bugged, where basically the stasis should cap at 50% of whoever her target's max HP is what it should. However, it seems to be only capping at 30% of the target's HP. She does additional damage, 120%. That's what is adding to the stasis. So let's say if the enemy has 100,000 and she's doing 1,000 damage, she's basically doing 0.01% stasis of whatever her attack is. So it's not a lot if the enemy has a lot of HP. Basically, you'll you'll never see the stasis. But if it is a bunch of enemies that have a low amount of HP, then the stasis will actually start to be doing things. So just the stasis portion, which basically the portion of the HP is permanently frozen and cannot be recovered. On that, it means that they cannot overheal past that. The other thing is that shields can still bypass that max HP deficit. So if you would think that Stella would be kind of a counter to Ona, and she somewhat is, but she's not a full counter just because the overshield can continue to be reapplied. And so when Stella is doing damage to non-shielded enemies, her damage is extremely low. Now that that's been said, we're going to continue moving on with this. So when a unit with stasis is defeated, Stella casts her special again on the enemy with the most stasis. After the battle begins, Stella becomes untargetable and teleports behind the furthest enemy, dealing 1000 attack damage. Actually, I should look at this with the highest values. 1500% attack piercing damage, setting them as the target. When she's below 50% health, she will cast again on the enemy with the most stasis, triggering at most once every 8 seconds. So she can't basically kill an enemy and just teleport again. The other interesting thing is her tooltip icon for this, where it looks like a triple 1 2 3. That's actually how this teleport is. So when she teleports, it's basically in a Z shape. She goes up, then she goes down, and she crosses back to wherever the farthest target is. I was like, okay, that's pretty interesting there. On the piercing damage itself, actually, we'll just continue reading on this. So basically, she defeats an enemy with stasis. She casts special again on an enemy with the most stasis. Additionally, her next ultimate costs 1 less blood soul. So that can be pretty good because an ultimate cost of 4 for a quasi DPS is what I'll say she is. And then if that gets reduced to a 3, that's fairly decent for a sub DPS, and especially as like a crescent moon. Something I did not test is whether or not this trigger is affected by if any other enemy kills it. I think when I was testing it, it's as long as an enemy has stasis as they're defeated, her ultimate will cost 1 less blood soul. And this does stack. So if she has a 4, this goes all the way down to 1. And then I think during Blood Moon it'll go down to a 0. I don't think I've seen this at a 0. That might be something I need to test one more time. The other thing is Stella's damage increases based on the target stasis up to a maximum 30%. So basically how it should work is if the target has 50% of its HP locked behind stasis, Stella should be doing an extra 30% more damage. However, in testing, these numbers were not correct. So basically the 50% was actually up to 30% of its max HP. The other thing was this 30% damage increase never triggered. It actually appeared to have an inverted relationship where the more stasis they had, the less damage she was doing. So I was like, so I'm wondering if either it was not worded correctly or if it's messed up somewhere. So that's going to be a bug report that I'm going to basically bring up with the devs. So I was like, okay, that's very interesting on that. So her basic attack deals 2 hits to the target for a total of 127% attack piercing damage. So both of her hits does trigger her talent twice. So that is a very unique thing in that it's the first that does 2 hits stated in the basic attack. There's many other characters that have multiple hits for their basic attack, but it's just not stated inside of here. So she does the 2 hits, and it is an even split for that damage. So it's the same damage basically. There's a little bit of variance due to the damage formula, but it's the same percentages for both of them. Her ultimate teleports to a select location, becomes untargetable, rapidly casts Blade Barrage, dealing it 8 hits of 172% attack damage to all enemies within close range. So the untargetable portion is only while she's ulting. As soon as the ultimate ends, then she becomes targetable again. So it's kind of weird. It just basically temporarily removes targeting. But if she is the last person alive and she does her ultimate, then she could just immediately be targeted again. So it's kind of weird for how that works. The teleport radius on it is fairly decently big, but the AoE on it is it's bigger than Mass's explosion. I'll say that much. It's a fairly decent sized. So additional attack of the 127%. So this is pretty interesting in that if there are multiple triggers, because it's basically when she deals damage to a target. So if she's triggering other damage from additional sources, then this is also triggering her talent. So the biggest thing that you need to take note of for this, so for Philosopher's Stone, upon a crit hit, fires 4 bullets at the target, dealing 300% attack damage, magic damage. So we've tested this. If she does a crit hit, she is indeed doing magic damage with this damage. So she could scale potentially off of that if that's what she was going for. The other thing that I tested for it was whether or not each tick of these bullets are triggering her talent. If we look at her talent again, just to reiterate that, so basically it triggers every 6 seconds for Philosopher's Stone, but this is whenever she does damage, it does an additional 127 piercing damage based off of that. I did some maths on what would be a perfect scenario at maximum level. So if her talent is indeed getting triggered, so basically if every significant hit every 6 seconds is indeed the critical hit and triggering this is what I found out. So she is basically doing a total of 48,018% total damage within 12 seconds and a single ultimate. That number dropped down to basically 3,500% total damage within that 12 seconds. Depending on whether or not she is triggering the special and whether or not she is triggering Philosopher's Stone at exactly 1 second in, because Philosopher's Stone triggers every 6 seconds, I believe. So basically, if she's triggering it 3 times within that 12 seconds, she's doing the most amount of damage possible. It's all dependent again on whether or not that critical hit is getting triggered exactly when those 6 seconds. Stasis doesn't really work on bosses just because their HP pool is so large, you never really notice the stasis on them because I don't think there's a single boss that really heals. They all have fixed HP bars. So that's piercing damage and adding to the stasis, whatever, none of that is really coming into account. Not many of the bosses shield themselves either. Something else to note is that some of the bosses have like a little purple countdown HP bar that pops up during certain phases, like going between the first and second phase before like the last HP bar on certain intervals, like every 30 seconds, whatever. So her piercing damage does not trigger the 200% damage bonus to shields. So that is telling us that the purple bar on bosses, that is not actually a traditional shield, is not triggering her piercing damage. Let's see, what else did I test? So stasis is not a debuff. It does not trigger the Poseidon's Skull. So Poseidon's Skull on her is useless. It doesn't do anything, no bonuses for her. You get the additional, if you have it at level 5, it does the additional hit. Between that, maybe Eye of Truth might be good for her, else you would likely want to be using Philosopher's Stone for the additional triggers of her talent. During Mausoleum, she's actually decent in Mausoleum. However, I will clarify and do like a disclaimer statement. She's only decent if you are playing manually. If you aren't playing manually, then she's very, very, very horrible. So the final things that I really need to test for her are whether or not stasis can be purified or cleansed. Because if she can, that might add a little bit more utility to Seth and to F. Bella, who are the two who could cleanse and purify. That's pretty much it for the testing as far as just my notes. So we'll go into one of these stages. The best one that I found was this Dutchman's, and then I went into this one just because I could kind of redo the tests, and that just so you could see some of the things that I'm talking about here. So we'll go ahead and put her in. Okay, yeah, there he is. So when she's targeting the furthest enemy, it's kind of weird. In most PvE content, it's usually going to be 1 or 2 enemies that she's able to target. There aren't very many instances in which she's able to target multiple enemies. She's always targeting the furthest backline enemy, and it's distance between, you could kind of see this blue line going on here. It's always going to be one of those two. In the case where it's a tie in the middle, it's always going to default up because that's the way targeting goes. It's always basically upper right, so right to left, top to bottom. So it's always going to default in this order, basically, is how it's going to work. So that means that more instances than not, she will target the top 2 rows. So that is a little bit helpful in PvP and meaning that if you have your characters in these top 2 rows or in these bottom 2, in case you have whatever in your 3x3 square, she's more likely to target the top 2 columns than she is the bottom column, or rather, there's more RNG in it. That means that if you put your character in the bottom, then she's going to easily hit that bottom square. She has the same sort of targeting priority as Augustine, so it's kind of weird where if the enemy T Aeona in PvP is in the very backmost column, and then you do Stella on her, then it's pretty much the same as if you're doing an Augustine. In fact, when I was doing testing battles earlier, I found Augustine was actually better because Augustine can physically turn around the enemy. Something else that was introduced in this update, Escalrain and Mass no longer seem to be turning the enemy Timeless Aeona if they are placed in the front row. Typically there's a slight delay with Escalrain, but Mass has always been able to instantly teleport. That is no longer works in PvP. So because of that, Mass, her rating for this Season 5 PvP has dropped dramatically, and Escalrain could no longer turn Timeless Aeona either. So that means that if you are lucky and the enemy Timeless Aeona is in the third or the furthest row, then you would want to be using Augustine. Stella works fairly decently as long as the enemy does not have a Quinn slotted for the second, as long as the enemy Timeless Aeona is not in the second row or closer. That would pretty much be the only uses in which Stella would be a good counter for Timeless Aeona. The teleport is also kind of weird, and let's say if you have like an Escalrain as well as a what is this, your Stella? If I had something like this and the enemy had an Escalrain and it was targeting and it was going to be hitting my other Escalrain, they would actually just target Escalrain first and then whoever's behind there. So be mindful of if you're placing Stella in your front line, because what that could do is force the change of who Stella is targeting to be potentially your third row or even additional deeper into your first row, rather than if I was to do something like this and there was nobody targeting here, the bounce would just be in the first. The other additional thing for PvP is that if Stella is targeting, let's say, an Escalrain in the furthest back corner, she's actually going to teleport to whoever he's teleporting to in the middle or the front rows usually. So that kind of throws off her targeting, and that means that Stella could easily be baited if Escalrain is in the last row of the enemy team. So that was kind of like, okay, so when people ask, oh, is Stella a counter to Timeless Aeona? It's like very, very niche circumstances in which she does that. So we're going to go ahead and just run this just so you guys can kind of see how it works a little bit. I'm going to put Akka back in, so it's just another healer. So pretty much Stella's going to be my only damage here. Then we're going to run it like so, where it's going to be you, kind of like this. And then I'll just go ahead and turn auto battle on and 1x speed. So you kind of see she did a little like a triple Z. Then she did her special teleport again, it looks like. And then she's doing her 2 hits, basically 1, 2, and then it's triggering twice more for her talent hits. So it's okay, I guess. Maybe I didn't save or something is gone, but we'll go ahead and do this. So you could kind of see the cost reductions are going on here. So if I do this right here, it did fairly decent damage because the enemies are over my BP. So if I look at the battle stats, she did most of the damage by far. We're like, okay, that's kind of to be expected. I'm going to go ahead and undo this, leave, and then I'm going to enter into a hard stage, and then you'll be able to see some of the differences here. This is a 70k deficit. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's fairly high. Alright, so we're going to do something like this. Again, the setup is going to be the same type of setup. Maybe instead of Fleeting Bella, I'll do something like this instead, just so everybody stays alive longer. And then the things that we're looking for basically are the damage that she's doing. So there was the 1, 2, 3 that she did. Okay, there's my Akka. So you see she's hitting these enemies right here. I'm just going to turn this off. You could barely see the stasis going down. So we'll go ahead and cast this right here. And you see it's hardly doing any damage whatsoever. Cast this, get the rotation going. Wait for Quinn to be down. Okay. And we're gonna cast Stella once more. And so, yeah, it's just she's doing non-existent damage right now. So you'll see. We'll see if she survives this hit here. Probably not, because this enemy has a enemy, or there's a like a trial enemy here. So if there wasn't a trial enemy, I wanted to show the targeting on it. So you could see 160,000 damage. That was it was pretty far in, but she just did 0 damage. Hits like a wet noodle. However, if it's a shield, man, she bashes down that shield. So if there is a clan hunt or an event that has enemies that continuously shield with the standard shielding, then and only then I think she will be good. In pretty much all PvE content that we currently have, she's not going to do well in. So that's going to be story stages, she's not going to do well in. She's not going to do well in Infinite Abyss, she's not going to do well in Dutchman's Revenge, she's not going to do well in Tomb of the Fallen. She does kind of okay, again, as I said, if you're doing manually in Time Worm Mausoleum. Again, not so much. In Blood Arena, somewhat okay. Gauntlet, I don't think she's going to be a long-term counter unless something changes, or people figure out a better comp, or more people have a level 5 Philosopher's Stone or higher on their Stella. For Crucible, she may or may not find some use just because she is that whatever Crescent Moon slot as a sub DPS, and so she should be able to fill in as that sub DPS slots in a third team potentially. That's my thoughts on her right there. So here we are, Stella, Bloodborne, Medium Assassin, Crescent Moon, Piercing, Melee, Teleport. I already went over the stats already with her. Again, I don't need to recap that. So here we are at the Character Builds tab. So again, her Abyss artifact is most likely to be Philosopher's Stone, else maybe Eye of Truth. Again, this still needs more testing on it. Skill priority, probably going to be fairly low. Maybe like a 4. If you are super focused on PvP, then she might bump up a little bit higher because her ultimate range is large enough where it can still hit the enemy Timeless Aeona, depending on who the target is on the enemy that is directly behind a Timeless Aeona, provided she's in the second column and not the third column. I still need to go through what these would be. Most likely to be something like attack speed, all damage bonus, and then like a blood soul recovery, just because she's not really there as a damage roll. And then her kill ups are most likely going to be her ultimate, and that's gonna be it. Like just all in her ultimate. Her special is like a one-time use, but it can re-trigger more than once, which is a little bit different than like a Gilrain. In that instance, it is a little bit better, and it is a fairly high percentage on it, but it'll probably be ultimate, basic attack, maybe talent, depending on whether you're PvP focused or not. And then we'll see if she has other modes. Going over to the data table for her. So overall, right now she's currently a D rank, just because of the way that this is working is all of these are counting as non-negotiables. If it was to include just the content that she's good for, somewhat okay in Bloodborne, just because again that slot, somewhat okay in maybe in PvP. Only 2 modes that still need to be tested more. So right now, very complicated kit, very long review on her, still more things that need to be tested, but overall I would say she's fairly low currently. If something changes, maybe she'll have like a certain event that she'll be really good in, as was the case in Agnes when they came. So we'll just have to see on that, how she turns out. So that's going to be it for Stella, the complete overview, the super deep dive on this character. Hopefully this helps explain a little bit on her. Hopefully it helps others to understand her kit and things work. Hopefully her kit gets fixed as far as the talents. Maybe she gets a little bit of a buff. We'll have to see. So we'll go ahead and look forward to seeing you all in the next one.